There's a lot of reasons why your doctor may choose IVF versus ICSI, but those are the two main methods of fertilization. So the day after the egg retrieval, that's what we call day one of embryo development. You had day one of your stimulation cycle a few weeks ago when you got your period and started the injections. And now we're talking about day one of embryo development. On day one of embryo development, our embryologists are going to call you and tell you from the eggs that you had retrieved, how many of them fertilized with sperm. On average, fertilization rate is about 70%, whether we're doing IVF or ICSI. Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as our baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
This episode is inspired by our listeners. We put a call out on social media to find out what people wanted to hear about for a podcast topic. And we got an overwhelming number of responses requesting information about IVF. The people want to hear about IVF, so we're very pleased and very excited to start bringing what the people want. We're going to be talking a little bit about IVF in this episode. For the record, though, this is not going to be the only episode about IVF because there's so much to cover and so much to talk about when it comes to IVF.
For sure. And I love IVF personally because I owe my family, my beautiful two children, to the miracle and the glory of IVF.
Aww.
I want to start telling you a bit about the story of IVF, which is absolutely fascinating. The first IVF baby was born in England in 1978, which is not that long ago. It was Dr. Edward, Dr. Steptoe, and nurse embryologist Jean Purdy that are credited with this incredible gift to modern medicine. Dr. Edwards actually received a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2010, but unfortunately Dr. Steptoe and Jean Purdy were not eligible because they had already passed away by this time. And Nobel Prizes are not awarded after the recipient has died. When IVF started, there was no ovarian stimulation at all. The eggs actually had to be retrieved by laparoscopy, and it was Dr. Steptoe who did the first egg retrieval by laparoscopy, and it was fertilized by Dr. Edwards and John Purdy, who had trained as a nurse, but actually started working as an embryologist in Dr. Edwards' lab. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Jean Purdy because women's contributions to medicine are always being ignored, and the story of IVF is not different when it comes to that. John Purdy was actually the first person in the world to witness a human egg being fertilized in a laboratory. When it was decided to put a plaque up to record this amazing achievement of the world's first IVF baby, Dr. Edwards suggested that the plaque should really acknowledge the three contributors. However, the hospital at the time ignored this request, and because of this, Dr. Edward wrote a strong letter of complaint and insisted that Jean Purdy needed to be included in this plaque. Another plaque was then erected in 2013 after the Nobel Prize had been given, and again, it ignored John Purdy's contribution to the amazing achievement that is IVF. Now, the son of Dr. Steptoe really advocated for Jean Purdy, who by this time had passed away at age 39 from malignant melanoma. It was not until 2018 that Born Whole unveiled a memorial that actually acknowledged the three contributors and specifically named Jean Purdy as the world's first IVF nurse and embryologist. The team actually performed more than 40 embryo transfers before achieving the first pregnancy, which actually happened to be an ectopic. It was the second pregnancy that was achieved by this team that led to the birth of Louise Brown, who was the world's first IVF baby. Since then, it is estimated that over 10 million children have been born via IVF, with approximately 2.5 million IVF cycles performed annually in the world, and 500,000 children are born every year through this treatment.
That's wild.
Right?
Like when you think about, the story of it, and when you think about how much things have changed just since 1978. Because it's like 40 some odd years. And now so many families, so many children can really be credited to this particular discovery.
And when I was researching for this, I saw a lot of information about the backlash that they got back in the day. They were getting like hate mail, being told that they were crazy, they were playing God, that they're gonna like destroy humanity with this. And there's documents of them being threatened in a lot of this.
Well, thank God that they kept at it and that they did this.
It's incredible. So now let's talk about IVF, how we do it today, which is very different to the way that Dr. Edward, Dr. Stato, and John Purdy did it. So in modern days, IVF can be divided into 4 parts. There is the stimulation phase, the egg retrieval, the embryo culture, and the embryo transfer. The stimulation phase is what is needed for the ovaries to produce eggs. So we're going to talk about this in more detail. In a natural cycle, the ovary is going to produce 1 or 2 eggs at the most. That is just the way that the natural cycles is designed. With the use of control ovarian stimulation, the ovaries produce way more eggs. Now, how many? That depends on your ovarian reserve. And your ovarian reserve is measured by an ultrasound looking at the antral follicle count as well as a hormone called AMH levels. There are many different categories of injections that we give you to make the ovaries produce more than the natural 1 or 2 eggs. They're all in the injectable form, and as a general term, they're called gonadotropins, and they drive the development of the eggs. There's another type of injection that you need during a stimulation cycle, and that is a medication that prevents your ovaries from ovulating on their own. Remember, during an IVF cycle, the goal is for the ovaries to produce a lot of eggs, for those eggs to mature, and for the fertility specialist to be able to get those eggs out of the body before they're released. So there is a medication that is given to stimulate the ovaries to produce eggs as the gonadotropin, and another medication that is given to prevent the ovaries from releasing those eggs before the IVF physician is able to remove them. That medication is usually an antagonist, but also an agonist can be used to prevent ovulation. Now, once the ovary develops the number of eggs that we feel is appropriate according to your ovarian reserve and according to your goals for an IVF cycle, then we have to give you another medication called the trigger. And the trigger is a medication that is given to make the eggs inside the follicles mature. The timing of the trigger is very, very important because we want to make sure that when we get those eggs, first of all, you hadn't ovulated prematurely, and the eggs are mature enough that they can be used in an IVF lab. In deciding a protocol, a combination of the gonadotropin, the medication that prevents ovulation, and the type of trigger, there's many, many aspects that come into effect, and this is where the art and the science of IVF comes in. We look at age, we look at prior cycles, we look at your reproductive goals, we look at your costs of the treatment, we look at prior experiences, and we can talk about that in another episode where we go into details about the different types of IVF protocols.
During the stimulation phase, you're going to be taking daily injections that are going to be based on the IVF protocol that was chosen by you and the physician. And the stimulation phase really requires a lot of cycle monitoring. So let's talk about what cycle monitoring is, because I think this is something that's worth talking about. Cycle monitoring basically refers to appointments where you're coming into the IVF clinic where we're going to be doing blood work plus minus an ultrasound. So on blood work, we're looking at estrogen levels. We're looking at the luteinizing hormone or LH levels as well. And then on ultrasound, we'll also take a look at the size and the number of follicles. Now, these ultrasounds are typically done transvaginally. What we want to see is that the estrogen level is rising, which indicates that the ovary is responding to the gonadotropins, to those injectable medications, and that we're also using that to determine the risk that somebody might have OHSS, and that will later on help us guide what kind of trigger we may end up using. We also look at the LH because we want to make sure that it's not rising. Because if it rises, then you can have something called premature ovulation, where the follicles can actually release the eggs out, into the abdomen before we have an opportunity to get them. So we want to make sure that that's not happening. That's why we're monitoring that LH to make sure that the follicles are not going to ovulate early. The size of the follicles that we're seeing in ultrasound is also really important because that will help us determine what day we should actually do the trigger medication to trigger that final follicle maturation stage and to plan the egg retrieval. So this will vary a little bit from clinic to clinic and depending on how they're measuring the follicles. But generally speaking, in a follicles 1.7 or larger, we're going to expect it to contain a mature egg. Ideally, we want to keep it under 2.1, under 2.2 in size. But again, that will vary a lot based on previous IVF cycles and sort of how the clinic may be measuring these things.
And I think it's important to notice here that we're looking at the majority of the follicles, right? Not every follicle is going to be perfectly between 1.7 and 2.0. Usually at the time of the triggers, there's going to be follicles of all sizes. And the job of the REI physician is to look at what is the biggest cohort of follicles that we can get and then trigger according to that. So I want to talk a little bit more about the stimulation phase. We got lots of questions on Instagram about IVF in general, but I want to talk about the stimulation phase now. So I'm going to put you on the spot today, Dr. Weiss. So in terms of the stimulation, what is the typical length of a stimulation that you normally see?
Number one, it varies person to person. And it's a question that comes up a lot. And I actually think it's not that important. And the reason I say it is because we're not aiming for a specific number of days of stimulation. And it's not that we would cancel stimulation just because it's longer than what we like. Every pair of ovaries is different. And so we really are personalizing every stimulation, lengthwise even, to sort of how the ovaries are reacting to the medications and what the follicles are looking like. That being said, average stimulation is probably, around 10 to 12 days of medications.
Yeah, the only reason I think it's important is because people need to plan their lives. So I know that's a question that I always get asked. In terms of how many appointments you would be doing in those 10 to 12 days, it's usually about anywhere between 3 to 5 appointments. And again, everything that we do is very individualized, but we normally bring you in on day 2 of the cycle, then again on day 5, again on day 7, maybe day 8 and 9, or maybe just day 9. And again, the usual length is about anywhere between 10 to 12 to 14 days in that range. Now here at Markham Fertility Center, the appointments are really early in the morning because we know that you need to get on with your day and get on to work. When you come in, you're going to have your blood work, your ultrasound, or maybe only blood work if that was scheduled for you. You're always going to meet with one of our nurses who are going to explain to you the results of the ultrasound, make sure that you're doing okay with the medication, that you understand your instructions. And if you need more medications for the upcoming days, they're going to set you up with that as well. Then around lunch times, all the physicians or MSc are checking the results on the portal. Now we have the results of the ultrasound and the blood work, which the nurses wouldn't have in the morning. And then putting those two things together, we make decisions for the next day. And those decisions are communicated to you through the EIVF portal.
What side effects can you expect during the time? What do you usually talk about?
Some people don't experience anything at all, and they come and tell me it was straightforward, they didn't feel any different. A lot of people do experience side effects. Some of those side effects could be bloating, because remember, your estrogen level is going up, your ovaries are getting bigger. You could experience headaches, some mood swings, bruising in the injection site. Some people can get very tired. I know when I was going through IVF, I found myself exhausted during the time, but I think a lot of that is also the emotional burden that you're carrying when you're going through an IVF cycle. Lots of people ask me if you can work during your simulation phase of the IVF cycle, and the answer is yes, you can. Now, the appointments have to be in the morning, so if you're doing night shift, for example, you're not getting off your night shift until 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., then you might need to adjust your night shift and not be able to do that for that reason. But physically, people can work during the simulation phase, and they might just need to adjust their schedule in terms of when they start and when they end their workday.
And what about exercise? I mean, I think that's a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah, so you are free to exercise during the stimulation phase. You might feel different, especially if you're somebody that have high ovarian reserve and the ovaries are getting bigger. If you're doing jumping jacks, that might be very uncomfortable, but you can exercise as long as you're listening to your body and sort of being gentle with yourself. I would say that once you get to the point where you're very close to your trigger time, and especially if you're somebody that has high ovarian reserve and loss of eggs in the ovary, then you want to be more careful about exercises because of the theoretical risk of ovarian torsion or rupture.
What's ovarian torsion?
Ovarian torsion, it's a condition where the ovaries have like a little pedicle that attaches them to the abdominal wall, and that pedicle can twist on itself. And that sometimes happens when they're bigger than they usually are during an IVF cycle and when they have a cyst. To be clear, ovarian torsion is very, very rare, and I have very rarely seen it, if any, during an IVF cycle, but there's always that theoretical risk. So when we know the ovaries are big, then we do have a bit of caution in terms of some exercise because of that theoretical risk.
And I guess probably one of the really common questions is, when somebody's going through a stimulation, what can they do to maximize their success?
Yeah, that's a great question. The most important thing is make sure that you are following your instructions correctly. The time that you do your gonadotropin injections is not as critical as it is the time that you do your triggering injection. But I have people that got confused and took the agonist too early or the trigger at the wrong time, and that could be really detrimental to an IVF cycle. So make sure that you're following the instructions. And part of following the instruction is having a good relationship with your clinic and your nurses, making sure that you are vocal if you're not understanding something and you're asking again. Don't be shy to say, can you explain this to me again? I'm not very clear. Show me where to find the information. That's what we're here for, to make sure that you feel comfortable with all of that. And I think managing your emotions going through an IVF cycle is really important because there is no sugarcoating this. It is an emotional roller coaster, and we're going to get into that later in this episode. But there's a lot of writing on it. There's a lot of finances that are invested, a lot of, your hopes and your dreams for your family are invested into the cycle. So there is no question that really spending the time in managing your anxiety, your emotions, your ability to understand instructions and remain calm are really important. And then, of course, all the things that we've talked about in prior episodes about health and lifestyle and egg quality. So avoid drugs, alcohol. During the stimulation cycle, make sure you're taking your prenatal vitamins and any supplements that you and your doctor have discussed. So now we should talk about retrieval time. That's a very special time in an IVF cycle.
Yes, the egg retrieval is definitely the pinnacle, shall I say, of the IVF cycle. Feels like everything kind of leads up to the egg retrieval in a way. It's like the fireworks moment. When we're talking about the egg retrieval time, we're talking about that transition from the stimulation into that next phase. And so the way that we start that is by using a trigger medication. Again, what type of trigger medication we're using will be determined by your doctor depending on what your estrogen levels look like, the follicles that you had, the size of previous stimulations. But generally speaking, the trigger medication is about 36 hours prior to the actual retrieval. And this is so, so, so important. This is one of those things where we tell people you need to set a timer. We want to keep it as close as possible to this 36-hour time. This is really critical. When somebody is doing a cycle at MFC, the nurse will give them specific instructions on exactly their time of trigger and which trigger they should be using. And I'm sure in another episode we'll go into types of triggers and why we choose them. So at Market Fertility, all of our egg retrievals happen really early in the morning. And so that we are
really early in the morning.
Yes, really, really early in the morning. We are done by 8 a.m. usually. That means we sometimes start as early as 6 a.m. So yes, for the record, everyone at MFC is an early riser.
Which means, the doctors and
early birds,
the nurses are getting up at 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. to be here on time for 6 a.m.
Oh yeah, 4 a.m. because I got to do makeup. That's crucial.
Of course you do. So we should talk about why that is. It's not because we are...
Makeup?
No. Not the makeup. We know why you wear makeup. You want to be beautiful for the patients, right?
And the eggs.
And the eggs. That's right.
It's all for the eggs, Dr. Garcia. It's all for the eggs.
Fair enough. But there's another reason why we do need to start early other than Dr. White's beautiful makeup. And that is anesthesia. So here at Market Fertility Center, we have anesthesiologists that come from the hospital to put our patients to sleep during an egg retrieval. Now, an anesthesiologist is a medical specialty that specializes in the science of sedation. So how is sedation different when it's done by an anesthesiologist versus when it's not done by an anesthesiologist? And the main difference is that anesthesiologists are able to use a very powerful sedative called propofol. And with propofol, you're basically in a very deep sedation, which is a lot more comfortable for patients. Also, because we have an anesthesiologist that can manage the airway, we're able to do cases at Markham Fertility Center that requires that bit of extra expertise from an anesthesiologist with other clinics may not have. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that we can do everything. There are some cases that we really cannot do here because we're still not a hospital. We're still a clinic. And there are cases that are so complex that can only be done in a hospital setting. So even having an anesthesiologist doesn't mean that we can do all cases here. The cost of anesthesiologist at MFC is part of the IVF cycle. It might be different in other clinics. I can't speak for it. The egg retrieval lasts approximately 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes even less. After the procedure, you'll go to the recovery room where the recovery room nurse is going to give you blankets and a heating pad and monitor your vitals and to make sure that you are fully awake before you go home. It's very important to know that there's no driving that day because of the medications you were given. Some people choose to still work, check their emails or whatnot. I think that everybody should take a day off and have a day to relax, the day of the retrieval. It's very important. This is the date. If we're doing an egg freezing cycle, then that would be the end of that. But if you're doing an IVF cycle, then sperm is needed on that day. It can either be produced fresh that day at the clinic, or sometimes we have frozen sperm available for a variety of reasons. So that concludes our information about the actual egg retrieval procedure. It's usually quick and for the most part it's painless. And the rest of the day you can do many things, just driving shouldn't be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still go to the grocery store if you want. If you want to watch a movie that day, you can. You'll be fully awake and capable of taking care of yourself, just maybe a little bit sleepy. And again, driving, it's contraindicated for that day.
Mm-hmm.
So then after the egg retrieval comes what I think is the most stressful part of the IVF cycle, which is the fertilization phase, the embryo culture phase. What do you think is the most stressful part of the IVF cycle in your mind?
Oh, all of it.
All of it.
It's all stressful, just in its own different, unique
That's
ways.
very true. That's very true.
I think the stimulation might be more stressful because I feel like that's more in my hands in terms of the dosing of the medications and when to trigger in this.
Yeah.
The retrieval is stressful because I truly desperately want to get an egg from every follicle and to get as many eggs as possible. The next part, it feels like it's more out of personally my hands. I just feel they're all different.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like having children and you're asking me to pick which one is my favorite.
I think it's the most stressful part, maybe because of that, because I can't control it, right?
Yeah.
It's like
We're not the ones doing
we're
it
not
in
the
the
ones
lab.
doing
Yeah.
it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the next steps. So now that the egg retrieval is completed, on the day of the retrieval, you're going to know how many eggs you have. You won't know how many of them are mature. You're not going to know how many fertilized. You're not going to know the quality of those eggs until later on. So you'll know how many eggs you have. We'll know what the sperm looks like on that day. The type of fertilization protocol will have been discussed prior to your egg retrieval by your physician, but the embryologists are going to confirm that on the day of the egg retrieval. There are two types of fertilizations. There's two ways in which egg and sperm come together. One way is conventional IVF, and that was how Dr. Edward, Dr. Septo, and John Purdue did it back in 1978. And that's when you have an egg and a sperm, and you put them both in a petri dish. You put that in the incubator. You close the door. The next day, you see if the sperm was able to eat away the layer of the egg and get inside and fertilize that egg. That is conventional IVF. There is another method of fertilization called ICSI, or intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And in this method of fertilization, the embryologist takes the egg, removes the layer around it, and then takes one single sperm and puts it directly inside the egg. ICSI is used in the case when there is a low sperm count or a low motility and is not enough sperm to fertilize an egg on its own. It can also be used as in case of unexplained infertility, because sometimes even though you have a perfect sperm sample, the sperm just doesn't insert inside the egg for reasons that we don't understand. And with ICSI, we can overcome that and inject the sperm directly inside the egg. So there's a lot of reasons why your doctor may choose IVF versus ICSI, but those are the two main methods of fertilization. So the day after the egg retrieval, that's what we call day one of embryo development. You had day one of your stimulation cycle a few weeks ago when you got your period and started the injections. And now we're talking about day one of embryo development. On day one of embryo development, our embryologists are going to call you and tell you from the eggs that you had retrieved, how many of them fertilized with sperm. It's very important to understand that not every egg that is retrieved is going to be mature. Sometimes they could be post-mature, sometimes they could be immature, and sometimes even if they are mature, they may not fertilize. Whether we're doing IVF or ICSI, neither one of those two guarantees 100% fertilization every time. On average, fertilization rate is about 70%, whether we're doing IVF or ICSI.
And so really, I think it's important to emphasize this drop off, right? And this kind of funnel effect, because not every follicle that you get on an ultrasound is going to contain an egg. Not every egg is going to be mature. Not every egg is going to fertilize. And not necessarily all of these fertilized eggs are going to grow into embryos and then go on to become blastocysts. And so the way that I think about it in my mind is that it is this funnel, right? Where we're starting with this many eggs, this many are fertilized, etc. So getting 10 eggs never means 10 embryos, right? And how wide or how narrow that funnel is really depends on the person. And age is really sort of the biggest driving factor. And that's something that I think is really, really important to emphasize. And I always like to talk about this funnel in the world of IVF. That's how I explain it.
Yeah. So the embryologist at Market Fertility Center, I can only speak for us, will call you on day one with your fertilization results. Then we'll give you another call on day 3. And on day 3, the embryologist talks about how many embryos have been developing from day 1 to day 3 and what the grading looks like. To be honest, the information on day 3 is not that critical. It's almost like when you're looking at a race sort of in the middle. It doesn't really tell you exactly who's going to win the race. Then we culture those embryos from day 3. We look at them again on day 5. Day 5 of the culture is when those embryos would have gone from a 2-cell, which is what they would be on day 1, right after fertilization, to the blastocyst stage. The blastocyst stage is basically an embryo that has grown and expanded. It has some cells in the middle called the inner cell mass. That's what is going to become baby in the future. And have some cells on the outside of the embryo, which are called trophoblasts. And those are the cells that are going to become placenta. So our embryologists will call you on day 5 and tell you how many of those eggs that fertilize on day 1 have gone on to develop into blastocysts on day 5. They're also going to explain the grading of those blastocysts, which we're going to talk about in a different episode. Probably with one of our embryologists. We should have them on the podcast as guests to talk about blastocyst grading and how they determine that. So if the plan was to do a biopsy of your embryos at the blastocyst stage, this is when the biopsy would happen. Now, there are some embryos that are not quite blastocysts on day 5. They're early blastocysts, or they are one step below a blastocyst at color morula. We want to give them time to become a blastocyst. So any embryos that are not at the blastocyst on day 5, they will remain in culture until the next day. That's called day 6. And then one more day until the day 7. So on day 7, you're going to get another call from the embryologist telling you how many more embryos made it to blastocysts on day 6 and on day 7. And these embryos will be frozen if that was what was decided, or it would be biopsy. It's important to know that not every embryo can be biopsy. And again, this is something that we're going to talk about in more detail in another episode as well. But some embryos just don't have a good grading for biopsy. So if that is the case, they might be frozen without biopsy. And again, our embryologists would explain that about your particular case. That concludes the IVF cycle, assuming that there was no fresh embryo transfer planned from the day 1 when you started your injections, then all the way to your trigger, the retrieval, the fertilization, the embryo culture, and the freezing. So after all of this is done, now if there was a biopsy that was planned, then we're going to wait for those results. And then once you have the results, you meet with your doctor again to go over all of the things. At that conversation, we talk about what the cycle looked like, the maturation rate, fertilization rate, blastocyst rate, euploidy rate if you decided to do PGT. And then if there are embryos available for transfer, this would be the conversation about what type of frozen embryo transfer protocol we will do, which deserves its own topic on a different episode.
As you mentioned, sometimes we will do a fresh transfer. A fresh transfer basically refers to putting an embryo into the uterus where the embryo has not been frozen previously. And so it would be done as part of the IVF cycle. They can be done for a fresh transfer either on embryo culture day 3 or sometimes embryo culture day 5. Fresh transfers were the standard of practice for many, many years before we got really good at being able to freeze and thaw embryos. But freezing of embryos has become much, much more commonplace nowadays. I would say right now at MFC, probably the rate of cycles in which we do a fresh transfer might be 10%, I would guess.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is probably driven by the fact that people are doing PGT, which necessitates doing a frozen transfer because you need that time to get those PGT results back. So then the question really is, why is that? Why do we do a fresh transfer, right? And there are a variety of reasons why the patient doctor may decide to consider doing a fresh transfer. And the first thing is timing. So when somebody is doing a fresh transfer, they have the opportunity, the possibility of getting to pregnancy faster, right? Because you're not delaying things to, let's say, freeze the embryos, come back in the following cycle to be able to do the transfer. So the time to an actual positive pregnancy test can be slightly faster. Another big thing is cost. When you're doing a fresh transfer, and this is assuming that there are no other embryos that you are freezing and thawing later on, you're saving the cost of that freezing and thawing. And so when somebody has, maybe one embryo available, maybe 2 embryos, then putting the embryos in a fresh transfer can be much more cost effective. Another reason why people do fresh transfers is that sometimes embryos can't be frozen. Sometimes the quality is not good enough or they don't reach the blastocyst stage. And so to be able to ensure that somebody's able to have a transfer at all, sometimes we'll opt to try for a fresh transfer. The lab is amazing here, but we know that eventually the embryo has to go into the uterus for a pregnancy to continue. So sometimes putting that embryo in sooner rather than later may give the patient and the embryo the best opportunity, the best chance to continue on and lead to a healthy pregnancy. And then I guess another reason sometimes where we might do a fresh transfer is where we're concerned about, let's say, sperm quality, egg quality, embryo quality, or we have a situation where somebody has recurrent implantation failure, for instance, and we've done frozen transfers, and now we just want to try something different to see if maybe this particular hormonal milieu will somehow do better and that we may actually achieve a pregnancy in those situations.
People ask all the time if it's a pregnancy rate, it's better with a fresh transfer and a frozen embryo transfer. And the answer to that question has actually changed a lot over the course of our careers, over the course of the field of reproductive endocrinology and infertility. So in the old days, the answer was straight up fresh embryo transfer. The technology to freeze embryos was very poor. And it was a well-known fact that your best chance of pregnancy were you're fresh. And this is when physicians were transferring 3-4 embryos at a time, because any embryos that weren't transferred fresh really had a very, very poor chance of pregnancy, as long as like 10% back in the day. That really changed with vitrification techniques. And now frozen embryo transfer rates are fantastic. They're so good that we've completely switched that. And now the pregnancy rates for fresh embryo transfers tend to be lower, and the frozen embryo transfer pregnancy rates tend to be much higher, as high as 65-70% if we're transferring a frozen embryo that has been genetically tested. Now, to be fair, the comparison between a fresh frozen embryo transfer pregnancy rate and a frozen embryo transfer pregnancy rate is not a fair comparison, because only embryos that have certain grading can be frozen. And specifically, if you're freezing and testing an embryo, then that's going to have a huge difference in pregnancy rate versus an embryo that you're transferring fresh. When you're transferring fresh, sometimes embryos are not blastocysts. Sometimes they're not embryos that could have been frozen. And for sure, they're not going to be genetically tested. So it's very difficult to do a straight comparison of pregnancy rates in fresh versus frozen. It's not fair. You're not comparing apples to apples. I wouldn't even say apples to oranges. You're comparing apples to like palm trees. It's just very, very, very different. But this is where the art of medicine comes in. So that's a discussion to have with your physician. Like Dr. White says, there are many reasons why we would suggest a fresh embryo transfer in some situations.
On the flip side, there are lots of people who aren't candidates for a fresh embryo transfer. And so even though a fresh embryo transfer might sound appealing, you get pregnant sooner, lower cost, doesn't necessarily mean it's a safe thing to do for everyone. The biggest reason I would say why I would advise someone against a fresh transfer is somebody who is at risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, or OHSS. So someone who is responding to IVF medications really well, and there's lots of eggs that are growing, they have a very high estrogen level. And we know that if we do a fresh transfer and then that person were to get pregnant, then that risk of OHSS increases by a lot, and then it can really lengthen that recovery process. Somebody who is at risk of OHSS, that's somebody where I would really strongly advise against a fresh transfer. The other situation that comes up not as frequently, but that can come up, is that if the lining is not looking good. So for instance, if somebody is doing IVF and they want to do a fresh transfer, but the thickness of the lining of the uterus, the endometrial thickness, is not very good, it's not looking good, or we know that they have a polyp or a hydrosalpinx or whatever reason that may not set them up for success in a transfer, then that would be another reason why I would advise them to plan to freeze the embryos and not to do a fresh transfer.
So I know that we didn't answer every single question that you had about IVF. We are going to record other episodes. We're going to talk about risk to pregnancy, medications, long-term risk to baby, as well as different protocols that we use. So you're not done hearing us talk about IVF, but for now, we are done with this episode, and we'll see you next week.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at myconfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.